So it is 2:02. I see that people are still joining, but we're going to go ahead and get started in the interest of time. Again, my name's Jamie Bograd, and you are on the monthly webinar, Admissions and Student Affairs webinar for this month of May. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Lisa Meeks. She is the co-founder and past president of the Coalition for Disability Access in Health Science and Medical Education. She's the co-developer of both the AACOM Disability Webinar Series and co-editor and author of the seminal text on Disability in Health Science, the Guide to Assisting Students with Disabilities, Equal Access in Health, Science, and Professional Education, and lead author of the AACOM Special Report, Accessibility, Inclusion, and Action in Medical Education, Lived Experience of Learners and Physicians with Disabilities. She is also co-creator of the social media campaign Docs with Disabilities and host of the Docs with Disabilities podcast. Dr. Meeks is the editor and author of 3 forthcoming titles on disability, including the September release of Disability as Diversity, a guidebook for inclusion in medicine, nursing, and health professions. A second edition of her book, The Guide, available in October, and a case study companion to the title Disability as Diversity, which will be out in December. On the chat function, you'll also see that Dr. Meeks and her team are currently gathering information on osteopathic medicine, and the survey link is there to gather information about the number of students registered for accommodation and their category of disability. It would be helpful if you, during or after the webinar, could fill out that survey as well. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce, Dr. Meeks to start.
Great, thank you so much, Jamie. This is an incredibly important topic, and I really want to thank Jamie Bograd for the invitation, and I want to thank the American Association of Colleges of Osteopathic Medicine for your interest in providing disability inclusion information to the programs. It's always such a pleasure for me to be able to talk about this area of diversity, and today I'm going to give you a very brief overview. What I cannot do in our short time together is impart all of the information that you'll need to truly grow your program and ensure that the services of your students are not only compliant and meet the legal requirements under the ADA in Section 504, but that they are robust and that they truly ensure that learners with disabilities that matriculate into your programs have the support and resources they need. Part of this resource development, however, is your knowledge and understanding of best practices for disability accommodation and inclusion. So I'm happy to say that I'll be giving you plenty of resources and you'll be able to educate yourself on the topic at your leisure. These resources do not reflect all of the available resources, but hopefully between the PowerPoint and the additional resources that you received in your packet, that will cover a good bit. That brings me to your packet. Hopefully all of you received it. I want to give you a very quick overview of what is included in your packet. First, you have an outline of the PowerPoint, and I did it in the notes version so that you can take notes as we're going through the PowerPoint, jot down things that you want to remember or remind yourself about later, and jot down any questions. I've left, I think, plenty of time for questions. When posing your question, you'll do it in the chat box. Please be cognizant of the fact that this is a public forum. And so to protect the identity of our students or particular situations that are occurring at your schools, I would ask that you only ask general questions without giving any identifying data. Let's see. There we go. Perfect. Okay. First, I'm going to give you an overview of the landscape of disability in medical education, and then we're going to move to what I call the best and the bad practices. These are practices that schools should embrace or avoid. I'll also highlight 2 star items. These are really important reminders for your program. And finally, and again, I think this is where this talk will help you the most, I'm going to give you a number of resources to consider for further expanding your knowledge. So here we go. What's in the landscape of disability in medical education? What's happening right now? Let's start with the prevalence. There's a lot of information on this slide. This overview is of my research. We have witnessed a 69% increase, and yes, that is correct, 69% increase in the prevalence of disability in MD or allopathic programs. We moved from 2.7% of the total population being students with disabilities in 2006 to 4.6% of students reporting disability in 2019. We've been really blessed to have good participation. So this is with about 65 to 68% of schools reporting. And these findings, both 2016 and 2019, are published in JAMA. We also collected, as part of this, specific information about psychological disability. And that data will be published in JAMA in the next few months. So in total, at this time, with about 62% of those allopathic programs reporting, we have about 2,082 students with disabilities in MD programs. Interestingly, the AAMC added questions to the year 2 survey and the graduation survey, and the results of their survey of students self-reporting, not going through their institutions, but self-reporting on that survey, were very similar to ours. So that's really interesting to me to see that students who are reporting having a disability are also disclosing to their institution. Good news. So in 2016, we had this benchmark data for our MD programs, but we didn't know how these students were experiencing the medical education landscape. One of the questions that I had was, how can we improve processes and what barriers exist in medical education? What needs to be addressed? So with that, we interviewed 50 students, residents, and physicians, and it all informed this report that you see a picture of here, which is the front page of the report. It was a UCSF AAMC dual report. The report has an entire section devoted to the legal background on the ADA and important cases of late. It also explains the legally mandated interactive process that I'll talk about in a little bit. For those of you who are looking to improve processes and practices at your institution, there's also a wonderful checklist in the back of this report as an appendices from which to compare your current practices with the AAMC considerations. And this is great if you have a goal of identifying opportunities to bolster your program, for example. I think the best thing about this report, it is 100 pages. So if you're having difficulty sleeping, now is a good time to download it and start reading. But the report is available for free in the AAMC store. So you can download this app for absolutely free. There is data missing from all of this, and obviously some of you will have noticed, and that is that all of these reviews and all of this data has been collected from MD programs only. In 2019, we attempted to survey DO programs, but had about a 5% response rate. So I'm really hoping with this new information and excitement around the topic of disability that you might fill out the survey that's only specific to DO schools at this point, the one you just received from Jamie Bograd. Even if you only have one student registered or no students registered at all, reporting this information, any information, is valuable. And we would love to get you this information and benchmarks so that you can compare the findings to the allopathic schools, and then together we can have information on the entire cohort of this growing population. All right. So lots of things are going on internationally. And last summer I had the opportunity to work with the GMC, which is the General Medical Council of the UK, towards creating an international council for disability inclusion in medical education. And our goal of that group is to take the existing guidance that we have from several different countries and to overlay those to find the baseline recommendations for programs. We will produce a report in the next year, and hopefully this will be helpful for not only US-based MD and DO programs, but for individuals across the globe. And finally, many organizations have identified disability as a valued part of diversity. And in this drive to diversify our programs, there are multiple calls to include students with disabilities. Students with disabilities, for example, may provide similar benefits that we've recognized in other physician-patient concordant relationships like gender, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. Individuals with disabilities also provide informed care. So as you saw in the quote prior, on that slide of the AAMC report, the learner that reported that said, I know that regardless of what I can't do, that I can take my experiences and say that I know what it means to be a patient. And that experience helps inform patient care and hopefully will improve and reduce healthcare disparities for our patients with disabilities. So this was my attempt to give you a little bit of a background of what's going on. As you can see, there's a broad reach for disability right now, not only nationwide, but across the globe. And some of you may be wondering, has this gone up to GME? And the answer is yes. For those of you who work in that space or crossover in that space, the ACGME now has a program requirement that programs are required to provide accommodations for trainees with disabilities in line with the institutional policies. So that was a great bit of news for 2019. So next I'm going to move on to the best and bad practices. So putting together this PowerPoint, as I said, I can't possibly review everything that you need to know in this brief introductory webinar. But what I did was I pulled out things that have been problematic for schools in general with regard to policy, and 4 things that have also been highly thematic in litigation or in the Office of Civil Rights, so OCR, or Department of Justice, DOJ, complaints and resolutions. I focused really on what's been happening in the last 5 years. So these topics are critically important to your programs. First, I'm going to talk about admissions. Admissions is often the gatekeeper for students with disabilities for a number of reasons. Importantly, communication about disability is absent in many admissions websites, in admissions materials, in invitations to interview, and in those matriculation materials where students go to find all of the information that they need to know about becoming a student in your program. Students with disabilities, therefore, are often left unable to navigate an environment, and they're not quite sure how they might fit in. For these reasons, some of them may not choose to matriculate at your school in the absence of forward-facing messages about disability inclusion. Dr. Lena Mehta at Case Western is one of the pioneers in working on admissions and facilitating access through admissions offices with regard to disability. And these recommendations here are some of the recommendations that are present in her article, which all of you should be able to get through your library system, and in her new chapter, Creating a Program Within a Culture of Inclusion, due out this September. So when I have references, what I've tried to do is put them directly on the slide. And then of course, you'll see them in your resources that you received in your packet. So first, you need to be aware of the barriers for students with disabilities and provide training to assist admissions teams in reducing these barriers. As Dr. Mehta offers in her chapter, this can start with knowing what questions to ask and understanding the legal ramifications for specific types of questions, but also gaining some confidence such as to not shut down conversations about disability out of fear, and to provide opportunities for all students to share their unique experiences and how that will inform medicine. 2, designate a specialized disability resource professional. You'll hear this throughout. And actually, this isn't public information yet, but the American Medical Association also wrote a report on disability that is coming out this fall. And one of their recommendations will be to hire a specialized disability resource professional in all medical schools. So just a little nugget of information there. This person should be the confidential conduit between the admissions office and the applicant, such that students who are interested in applying to your program can meet with the disability person and discuss their needs and whether or not they would be a good match for your institution. So number 3, ensure admissions materials and websites are accessible. So a lot of you make super cool videos for your admission sites, including interviews with students. And while these videos are fantastic and can make students really feel like they're part of a community, especially now in the time of COVID, I know that I sit on the admissions executive committee for Michigan, and we had to do our second look remotely. And so I know we're all trying to be super creative about how we reach students. But for the student that's deaf or hard of hearing, for the student who has a visual disability, or for the student who uses screen readers to read portions of your website, or who has processing issues, having your videos captioned and having your photos tagged is absolutely critical. Not only is it critical for equal access for these potential students and your current students, it's also legally mandated. You may have heard about all the lawsuits with MOOCs and online content. So I don't know how many of you have heard about that, but I can tell you that last year, Harvard reached a settlement with the National Association for the Deaf for not adequately captioning its publicly accessible online video and audio content. Harvard's settlement was more than $1.5 million. So let's take a second to put that in perspective. Captioning a video costs approximately $1 a minute. And actually, I'm not a tech savvy person. I mean, I'm really not a tech savvy person. If something goes wrong, I'll turn my computer off. I'll do a little voodoo. And when I open it up and turn it back on, I just pray that the problem is resolved. But I can actually caption videos. It is super, super easy. If you're not able to caption your own videos, or if your videos are longer than 5 or 10 minutes, you can pay someone to caption them. It costs $1 a minute. So for a 30-minute video, that's $30. So $30 compared to $1.5 million is a pretty significant difference. Therefore, I would have to say my official advice is to caption everything. The law requires that you caption things that are publicly facing, so videos and content. However, I would say, preemptively caption all of your content, whether it's behind a firewall or on a learning management system or not. Eventually, I think every medical school is going to have a deaf or hard of hearing medical student, and captioning helps everyone. And I will say, I know of 4 schools that are matriculating deaf students this year. So I'm super excited about the diversity that we're seeing coming into our programs. So Dr. Mehta's final recommendation is to make a statement. And it's important that you communicate that you welcome individuals with disability. And this is, really similar to the messaging that you use with traditional or underrepresented populations of students. You want to clearly communicate the process for disclosing a disability. You want to clearly communicate how a student might go about requesting accommodations. And you importantly want to state your commitment to inclusion. So here's an example taken from Dr. Mehta's home institution. Case Western University aspires to be an inclusive environment, believing the creative energy and variety of insights that result from diversity are a vital component of the intellectual rigor and social fabric of the university as a scholarly community. CWRU is inclusive of all people and already racial, ethnic, cultural, social, economic, national, and international backgrounds, welcoming diversity of thought, pedagogy, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expressed political affiliation and disability. So this is just one example. Those of you who know me, and I think I've worked with a couple of your institutions, so I can't tell if you're on or not because I don't see who is on this call, but I can tell you that there is an institution that I recommend a lot of people check out, and that's Rush University in Chicago. Their statement is still probably the most progressive statement I've ever seen on disability, and their technical standards are really well written. So that's a really good school to use as an example. You might want to jot that down. So one other thing that has been thematic and in kind of the lawsuits of late is this idea of who is qualified. And in some of the cases, schools were predetermining that a student would not be qualified to complete their studies based on very limited or incorrect information about disability, really kind of grounded in stereotype and bias. I have a star here, which means that otherwise qualified is kind of an important topic. And this slide reads, what otherwise qualified means is the ability to meet the admission standards, technical standards, and to maintain passing grades once admitted. This indicates that candidates are otherwise qualified to be in the program. Now, if a student cannot pass, even with all of the appropriate accommodations fully implemented, they are not otherwise qualified for the program. And this is taken from one of our forthcoming books, one of the chapters from our forthcoming books. One thing that I want to recommend to you, there's an article that just came out in Academic Medicine. I think the title is something like Discerning Deficit from Disability. And the lead author is Pat Wari, but if you search by my name, I'm the senior author, so you would also find it. And we present a model of discerning whether or not an individual needs additional disability accommodations. If a student continues to fail despite the onboarding of accommodations, what do you do? And so those decisions become very frantic for schools and promotion committees when they're not sure where the deficit lies. So that's an article that you might want to check out. Technical standards are a big part of our process. So the next thing that I want to talk to you about are technical standards. And these are the things that you absolutely, as you can see by the thumbs up, you must have in your program. 3 fundamental elements of technical standards: a statement that encourages disclosure, a statement that communicates a confidential process, a statement that directs students to the Office of Disability Services. So, and you can see the references below. There are several articles that reference that. So with regard to number 1, you want to make a statement that encourages and communicates the process of disclosure and that it's confidential, because if you don't, this is a disincentive to students. If students don't know who will see their documentation and they think that it might be the dean or it may be their faculty members, they're going to be pretty remiss to go through that process and disclose. So you definitely want to make a statement about the confidentiality process. And then, of course, something that directs students exactly where to go. This is also protective for the institution from a risk management perspective. It shows that in your technical standards that all students will see and perhaps sign, that's one of the recommendations I make, that students were directed to the appropriate office for disability disclosure. So if a student happens to say, I was never told, I didn't know how to find information, this is protective against that. And again, I've cited those references where you can get more information. So we get guidance from the Code of Federal Regulation that gives us an understanding of what discrimination is with regard to technical standards. And it reads, schools shall not impose or apply criteria that screen out or tend to screen out an individual with a disability or a class of individuals with a disability unless such criteria can be shown necessary for the provision of service program or activity being offered. So we're going to go to the next slide and I'm going to show you what a discriminatory technical standard looks like. And then I'm going to invite you to pull up your technical standards and take a look. In this case, I've used the example of communication. This is important because several lawsuits have been won by plaintiffs over communication. So these were deaf and hard of hearing individuals. And this is over the course of the last 6 or 7 years. And this is when the school asserts that in their technical standards, it says a student must be able to hear. And many schools have cited patient safety concerns as the reason that this provision is in their technical standards. But the courts have been very clear, and this is across the nation. If you know anything about the law, you know that there are different circuits, and some are a little bit more progressive and some are a little bit more conservative. But this is pretty much across all circuits. And what the courts are saying is that deaf and hard of hearing individuals are capable of being health science professionals and delivering safe and effective patient care when proper accommodations are in place. So let's look at what discriminatory technical standards looks like. For this slide, it says a candidate should be able to speak, to hear, and to observe patients in order to elicit information, describe changes in mood, activity and posture, and perceive nonverbal communication. A candidate must be able to communicate effectively and sensitively with patients. Communication includes not only speech, but reading and writing. The candidate must be able to communicate effectively and efficiently in oral and written form with all members of the healthcare team. So to make this easy, I've bolded and italicized 3 words, and those are speak, hear, and speech. Those are the discriminatory elements of this domain of technical standard. So let's move on to a well-written technical standard. This one says, students should be able to communicate with patients in order to elicit information, detect changes in mood and activity, and to establish a therapeutic relationship. That's really the competency we're looking for in this communication domain. And it says students should be able to communicate via English effectively and sensitively with patients and all members of the healthcare team in person and in writing. Written this way, it allows for the opportunity of a sign language interpreter or CART or some other bit of information. So what I will tell you is that if I were to have most MD or DO programs pull up their technical standards, or if I were to ask for a show of hands right now, I would say the majority of people raising their hands probably have some of this information or some of this language in their technical standards. So I want to remind you that we don't know what we don't know. And that's why we're gathered here today and why Jamie has brought us all together to learn. So I don't want anyone to feel bad about this. I just want you to know that this is one of the most problematic things that I see in technical standards. And most people renew or revise their technical standards when they're going through accreditation, but I would invite you to look at them earlier and just make sure that at the very least, the discriminatory aspects of those are removed. All right. What are the things that you should not do? You should not have discriminatory language, including hear or speak, in your technical standards. You should not have overly legalistic language that dissuades applicants. And you should not have a referral to an evaluative faculty member or dean, and this includes admissions staff. So if in the technical standards it says, if you have questions about meeting the technical standards or think you will need accommodations, you can contact the dean of admissions. That would not be an appropriate referral source. Remember, you want to send people to the right person, and that leads us straight into the next slide. And this slide is decision making. So who makes the decisions? And I would bet if we did another survey, which would have been an interesting thing to do, I'll have to think about that for next time. But if we did another survey, I bet there would be a lot of spread of who makes the decisions. And a lot of people I know wear many, many hats in their roles. And so we're all doing the very best we can. But in this case, it's really important. And there are pretty significant legal implications, but more importantly, there are implications about learners having barriers to the curriculum and potentially failing out once they've matriculated. So we don't want that. So everyone needs to see, as you can see on this slide, there's a one-way sign to a person icon. And there should be one point person in your institution that reviews requests for accommodation. This process of going to this person should be in writing. It should be followed to a T every single time. And it will lead you to an interactive process. So the interactive process is one where the disability professional meets with the student, and that is required by law. So I have a couple of examples. Sometimes I serve as an expert on cases, And a couple of examples that I've come across in the last few years. One would be a student fills out a form online and mails or emails, most likely, disability documentation to the school. And it's almost like a Wizard of Oz situation. You don't know who's behind that curtain. You don't know what's happening with the process. And what's actually happening is that a dean of students or somebody else who has a conflict of interest is actually taking in the information and then meeting with a small subset of faculty who may also have a conflict of interest if they're an evaluative faculty member, let's say. And they're making a decision about what they're going to approve or not approve. A worse model that I've seen this year is where the same thing happens, but instead of meeting as a group to discuss the requested accommodations, everyone is emailed the documentation, and in the subject line of the email, it has the incoming student's name and disability written next to it. So that's a big no-no. And especially when you have email communication that is not protected and password protected or something of that nature, or encrypted. So just in the last year, I've seen those two things occur. What the law requires us to do is to actually engage with that student, with that learner. You not only must they filling out that form is not enough. You must have a back and forth with the learner about what accommodations are appropriate and reasonable. The learner, the person with the disability, is the expert in how their disability impacts them. So when you're looking at documentation, your engagement with that learner should actually be considered part of the documentation that's being turned in. The disability professional or point person should not be someone who has an evaluative role or who will ever be a faculty member for that student or ever be in a situation where they're making a determination. So a student affairs dean who votes on whether or not a student is dismissed, as an example. And then if the disability individual needs to consult with faculty or specialists about whether or not something is competes with the technical standards or reduces the educational evaluation, then they can do that in a de-identified way so that the student's name and the documentation are not shared with this specialist, this faculty member or whomever, but that the functional limitations are shared and accommodation decisions are made in a completely kind of a blind manner, if you will. Then if the disability provider is still unable to make a determination or the faculty are not aware of best practices, that's when you can engage with other institutions or your near peers. And I would say go outside of just the DO programs as well. I know DO programs have an additional element to their core competencies that will make some accommodations that are provided in MD programs not reasonable for a DO program. But I will say that it's still very helpful to reach out. In fact, in one of the cases that occurred, a judge specifically pointed out in his decision for the student that the school did not contact any other schools and did not request information on how this was, how an accommodation could potentially be put into place. And so this is really important information, what's happening out there, what's happening with other people. And this is where I'll make a small plug for the website of the Coalition for Disability Access and Health Science Education. It's in your resource list, but they have a free website that you can go to. All of their resources are available. There's no login to get on the page. And they just have an amazing group of resources for you to check out. Should you decide to join the membership, it's fairly inexpensive. And I think anyone that is a member would say that the listserv is probably worth its weight in gold. Being able to exchange ideas or even just watching the conversation from afar and not engaging is pretty helpful. So students should not be disclosing their disabilities to faculty and asking faculty directly for accommodations. They should be going through this interactive process. So this is another one of those key points that I talked about in the beginning. Individuals who hold an evaluative faculty position, who serve in the role of admissions or student affairs, who function as the director of the program, should not be the point of contact for accommodation requests. No diagnostic documentation should ever be shared with faculty or administrators in the process. They do not need to know. And students should know that they can stop the interactive process at any time. I can tell you that I've been on a lot of consults where a student was working through the system through proper channels with a disability provider. And where things went wrong was when the student asked faculty members for an additional accommodation, and the faculty member, not understanding the process, engaged that student in a conversation about what might be appropriate. They might have even said, you know, this is okay. And because that's not the correct person from the institution to make that decision, it can become problematic. When people circumvent the process for requesting or, you know, revising accommodations, and students can potentially be given different pieces of information, and this really muddles the water. I've actually seen it turn faculty against administrators, and people get, you know, very upset, and then the student is left not really knowing what the approved accommodations are. And it's very, very difficult to walk back a decision that's been made on the fly or without regard for the legal responsibility that the school has. So a big takeaway, I think, is that have a process, stick to the process, no matter who the student is. We all have students that, you know, have varying personalities, and but no matter who the student is, what the situation is, everyone should go through the same process. And faculty really, really need to know that they also have to follow this process, and that they cannot circumvent the process, that it causes a lot of disruption, especially should something become litigious. So, all right, well, going on to the next topic, I want to take a quick moment just to see where we're at and whether or not there are any questions.
We do have one question. I think you touched on this about 4 or 5 slides ago, and it is, how would the designated specialized disability resource professional differ from a 504 coordinator, or does that differ?
Well, you know, titles mean different things at different schools. Generally speaking, a 504 coordinator is actually doing accommodations for the entire institution. So they're doing faculty, they might be doing fellows, residents. They kind of oversee legal compliance for the entire institution rather than just for the students. In those cases, and there's a lot of training that goes along with 504 coordinators, but the training is really specific to the breadth of the law and how it impacts the institution holistically versus the discrete information that a disability provider that's working with students or learners in a clinical setting might have. So a 504 coordinator would actually, in most cases, I don't like to generalize, but in most cases would probably have less information than a disability provider working in the trenches, if you will, with students in a clinical setting. So thank you so much for the question, and certainly keep them coming. I'll move on now to clinical accommodations and some other areas that have been problematic over the last 4 years. I've written a lot about different types of assessments. So you'll see a lot of citations there. But one of the things that I get questions about all the time is, do you accommodate OSCEs? Do you accommodate anatomy exams? Do you accommodate simulations? What about formative assessments? Those don't need to be accommodated because there's no grade. Or how do we change our assessment for problem-based learning exercises or small groups? And the answer is, the law requires that you engage with a student to consider all of the accommodations, no matter what the assessment is. It doesn't matter if it's formative or summative in nature. And I won't go into all of the details here. I gave you references. And one, just as an aside, is in your packet. I gave you a sample article, and that is the one on OSCEs, because it is legitimately one of the questions that I receive, I would say, weekly. But you absolutely have to go through that interactive process with a student with regard to every single type of assessment. One other complaint that I hear, not from the learner or from the disability provider, but the complaints I hear a lot is from the faculty, who say they get these letters that say the student gets time and a half on assessments. Well, what does that mean? There are a number of different types of assessments in medical education. And so it's important that the process is followed for every type of assessment, and that the disability service provider understands what those assessments are and what they're actually measuring, and the different components of those exams. So even in an anatomy exam, there are different sub-exams within most gross anatomy examinations. So I think it's super important for faculty to be having conversations with these disability individuals and with the individuals who are giving the information to faculty to come up with letters that are discrete to each type of assessment. So for example, an OSCE usually has 3 portions. Well, which portion is accommodated even within that unique assessment? And you should understand, a good rule of thumb is that disability service providers understand the process and what's being measured, and the construct. So don't leave this up to the faculty, even if it's a clinical accommodation. Make sure that you're going through that process very, very carefully. One of the things that I gave you in your packet was the flow chart. And so you can pull that up and look at it, and it kind of guides you through the decision-making process. So that's something to reference. Determination of all clinical accommodations go through this same flowchart. So whether you are looking at a lab or simulation exercise, all of these, you can use the same decision-making flowchart for all of those. Remember that you have to engage in this process. You can't singularly defer to a clinical faculty member on this. And that's one of the biggest problems I've seen. And I could list, oh gosh, off the top of my head, I could list 5 cases where this has been kind of the crux of the problem. And so that leads us to our thumbs down or bad practices. And this is the kind of summarily stating that you don't make clinical accommodations. And then what's usually tethered to that is another statement that says it's a patient safety issue. And we don't have time today for me to walk you through the patient safety requirements that the law requires, that you actually go through several steps to prove that something is a patient safety issue. And I can tell you that things have to be really, really bad and really, really likely for you to be able to dismiss someone on that, on those grounds. But just know that saying that you do not make clinical accommodations is just not okay. You will not, the courts will not support this. All right. So what is reasonable talking about accommodations? Well, extra time certainly is the biggest thing that we have. Hard stop restrictions on clinical time. So that usually translates to a 9 or 10 p.m. Stop time, and release from clinic, or in that case, a lot, I know that the LCME already endorses this, and certainly with our efforts towards wellness, I think most schools would be in hot water to not allow a learner to leave for therapy once a week. But this is a well-vetted accommodation across the nation. Specialized equipment, clinical placement accommodations are one set of accommodations that is widely used in a clinical setting, and that is to situate a student because of their disability-related needs. So this may be proximity to their therapist. It may be proximity to an infusion clinic where they have infusions once a month. It may be that the ability to drive is not there, so they have to be, they rely on public transportation, so they have to be closer to their clinical site from their home. So all kinds of reasons why these might be in place. And then there's service animals. And I have that kind of to the side in this photo for a reason. And service animals are not an accommodation. I want to be very clear about that. That service animals are allowed to go in probably way more places in the hospital than you might think. A really good article for this is called See Spot in the Clinic, and it's by Elisa Laird-Metke. So Laird-Metke would be the author name that you would search, and it's See Spot in the Clinic. And I believe it was a 2016 or 2017 article, but it gives you all of the CDC guidance and some additional guidance for bringing or onboarding a service animal in your clinic. All right. Oh, one more thing about accommodations is that one question I get is what is reasonable and who defines reasonable under the law? And unfortunately, the law does not define that, but we use regulations from different portions of the ADA to help guide our thinking in this area. So we also use a lot of case law. And what we have kind of constructed from this is that as long as something is, I'll use the word doable, that it can be done, then, and it doesn't show, and it doesn't impair two other prongs. So one of those prongs about whether or not something is reasonable, decision-making prongs, would be if the accommodation fundamentally alters the educational program. So if you're going to say something fundamentally alters your program, there are two things that you need to make sure that you do. One is, and this is really important, and this is where institutional history comes in, as being very helpful. One is that you make sure that you've never ever done that before. Because if you've done it before, if you've made an exception once, you are putting yourself at risk for not making the exception now. And the other prong is that you need to be able to make sure that you can back up that it's essential. You need to be able to prove that it's essential. And the way that I work with programs to do that is to map it from either accreditation or license requirements or graduation requirements back to a core competency. If you're not able to do that, you can't say that it's fundamentally altering your program. And then the other decision prong is that an accommodation would be an undue burden. And again, with this, there are two mechanisms of arguing this. What I will say is that it's never successfully been argued. So just FYI. One is that there's an undue burden financially, or that there's an undue burden administratively. And before you ask the question, because I know this question is going to come up, administering exams, even if you have a huge increase in the number of accommodated exams you're administering, is not an administrative burden, and it's not going to be a financial burden. So just to give you a little perspective, a $350,000 bill for an interpreter for a deaf and hard of hearing student in your program is not going to meet the criteria for a financial burden for the majority of your institutions. You would, well, we won't go into great detail, but I can say with 99% accuracy, it would not meet the burden. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is mental health. And I'm sure that a lot of you are dealing with this right now. We know that, our students are 25 to 30% of our students are going to present with mental health crisis during their time in medical education. And so this is really, really important. And the citation that I've given you here is a chapter that we wrote. What makes this chapter unique is it is the cross-section of mental health, medical education, and disability. So it's the only chapter that I'm aware of until another book comes out this year that looks at the intersection of all of these things, which I don't think we do well enough in our programs. So that's a resource for you to look up. But one of the biggest issues, and I see this in the courts, there have been 4 major cases in the last couple of years with regard to mental health, health science programs in general, and leave of absence policies. So we're going to talk about that for just a little bit. So schools tend to think in black and white, and this is particularly present in health science programs, particularly in medical school, where we've done a great job of saying it's okay to not be okay, and we will support leaves of absence for our students. But these two things are not mutually exclusive. They can actually cross over. So you can have someone who has a mental health condition who is also functioning with accommodation and able to maintain their status as a student and work through the program. It isn't this if-then situation where you present with a mental health condition, therefore you are not well enough to be here and you are relegated to a leave of absence. We know that students have acute and chronic episodes of mental health. And for anyone who's ever had a mental health diagnosis, you understand that for those that are chronic, they are lifelong. Students are not going to get over them. They're going to have ebbs and flows of how exacerbated their symptoms are or symptomology, but they're not going to get rid of them. They're going to manage them. And so learning to live with a mental health diagnosis is important. It's important for schools to understand this and for schools to also understand that accommodations can really help mitigate the impact on students. The courts have been very clear. Stanford, for anybody out in California, just went through a huge and very public lawsuit. It was resolved out of court. But there are other cases where the DOJ has gotten involved, and there are some resources and articles on this as well, and you can look at those in your references. So I won't go into too much detail, but 2 of those were health science programs. And one, the biggest DOJ case was a health science program. I can't remember if it was a physician assistant or a medical student, but something of that sort. So the biggest takeaways are about policy and your policy for a leave of absence and your policy for returning back off of leave of absence. And I would implore you to straight away look at your policies for returning off of leave of absence and make sure that you have some provision in there that states that students must be able to meet the requirements of the program, whether that be technical standards or however you have it worded, with or without accommodation. And that comes directly from a University of Florida School of Medicine OCR. It was an early resolution where the school entered into an agreement to improve their practices. But the OCR said, listen, you have told the student they can only come back when they're able to do this without the understanding that there are accommodations that could help mitigate this student's particular functional limitations and the challenges that they were experiencing in your program. So make sure that you have that language added, similar to what you would have on your technical standards, that these must be met with or without accommodation. So for leave of absences, make sure that you conduct an individualized assessment of the case and understand that not every student needs a leave of absence, that in some cases accommodations or even a 1 block absence, so if you're on a block system, having a student step out for 6 weeks versus a year can be helpful. Please do, and the DOJ implores you to defer to the treating physician's guidance. So if you have a wellness team and as part of your leave of absence or fitness for duty, return to school process is to have someone that's not the treating physician interview or do an assessment of the learner, that's okay, but you really do have to take into account the treating physician guidance because they know the learner best, and make sure that your decisions are grounded in, a good portion of the treating physician guidance. And that comes straight from the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice would actually have you defer to the treating physician wholly, but I know that many of us have systems in place that students go through. If you are having students go through a process to come off of leave of absence, make sure everybody that goes on leave of absence is going through the same process. You do not want to treat individuals with disabilities different than their non-disabled peers in any one of your processes. Do not require multiple signatures, letters, fees. I think the fee was the most egregious policy I've ever seen. But I've seen policies where, a student that's getting ready to go on leave of absence has to go around and get signatures from all of their faculty and the administrators. And that's really burdensome. For somebody who's going out on a leave of absence, chances are they're not at their best. Chances are they don't have extra time to run around. If it's a crisis or an acute presentation, they may not be able to do this at all. So just remove those extra barriers from your process and have somebody who can facilitate this type of thing in your office. I said earlier that we have multiple hats that we wear. Add one sliver to someone's hat and have them be someone who facilitates all of the things that are required for a leave of absence for the student and serves as kind of an institutional mentor for that process. Do not require these items on re-entry as well. I worked at the University of California, San Francisco for a very long time, and our process was probably the most progressive. It didn't require any reasoning, just a physician to say this is in the best interest of the student. You didn't have to give that really highly sensitive information about why you were taking a leave. And students could take a leave up to a year without really giving us any indication of why they needed that leave. We trusted the physician's endorsement that the student needed to leave. And that physician's endorsement or attestation was also the only thing that was needed for re-entry. There's a really good, one of the AACOM webinars is on this, and the previous dean of students from the University of California, San Francisco was on that, as well as a psychiatrist who was a dean of students in New York. And that's a really a great webinar. And so I would point you to that for more information on this. Remember that your school and the revenue stream that's coming in because they are a student may be their only source of support. So that same psychiatrist who's in New York and I, we're both Jewish, we laugh and say, not everyone has a mom at home giving them matzo ball soup and tucking them in and kind of over-mothering them if they need to go on a leave of absence. In fact, many of our students are from disadvantaged backgrounds. They might not even have a home to go home to. They certainly don't have a revenue stream that's not outside of their loans or scholarships that they're getting from your institutions. And home may actually not be a safe place for them psychologically or physically. So that's why it's important, going back up to bullet point number 1, to conduct an individualized assessment. Do some wraparound work and figure out what is best for your learner in this situation. All right, so we have, only 2 minutes left. All right, I thought I had a lot of time, but apparently I didn't time it as well as I thought. My apologies. Feel free to send Jamie questions for follow-up. But here are some of the resources. 10 free and accessible webinars from the AACOM, and the link is there. 4 books on the topic. The first 2 are available right now. The third will be available in September. You can pre-order it right now. And the fourth will be available in November. And the fourth is the second edition of the first. And there are some major changes to the fourth. So if you can wait, do wait. Importantly, all of these books, the second one is free from the AACOM, but all of these books, the revenue stream from these books goes directly to disability advocacy groups like the Coalition or MDisability at the University of Michigan. They don't go to any of the authors. All of the authors donated their time. So when we endorse these, no, it's not a personal gain. Resources via media. Jamie mentioned the marketing thing that we did early on. And so we have a campaign called Docs with Disabilities. You can search hashtag Docs with Disabilities on Twitter. You can look at our homepage. And then I also have a podcast. So if by the end of this meeting, you are not absolutely tired of hearing my voice, you can listen to me interview physicians and OTs, PTs, dentists that have disabilities and are out there working, and hear them tell their stories. Faculty training. When I was at UCSF, I developed free, you see this trend, faculty trainings that are still up on the UCSF website. These are 20-minute trainings for faculty. So this is a great professional development opportunity for you that is free of cost, and these are all accessible as well with discrete focus of topic. The disability, or the Coalition for Disability Access that I mentioned earlier, here's the homepage to their website. They're having a symposium in Napa in 2021. So if you're a wine lover like me, that might be a secondary motivation. Of course, first is our students and the information, but their website's down there. And then there is a series of upcoming webinars that I'm working on with the coalition. These, unfortunately, are not free, but they are the latest and greatest cases and trends that we see coming out. And again, they are on discrete topics. So you can choose to do one or all. And here is my email address. I'm slower to respond than I would like to be, but I certainly get around to it eventually. And so I welcome any questions from you. And I just want to say, in closing, I'm sure Jamie has something to say, but I just really appreciate your time today. I know, I see that there's 90 something people on this webinar, and we all have too much to do right now. Our learners are really struggling. It's a tough time for all of us. And the fact that you gave an hour of your time to get this information and hopefully, improve some practices on your campus, I just want you to know I'm honored. I really appreciate it. I'm thankful for the time. And I know your learners will be better off for you having these resources at your fingertips. So Jamie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Meeks. I really appreciate you spending the time with us today because we know how busy you are as well. If you don't mind, there are still about 70 people. If you maybe have about 5 more minutes, would that be okay, Lisa?
Sure.
Okay. There's a bunch of questions, but I'll try to just answer a few that I think could be helpful to all, and hopefully they don't take too much time for you.
Sure.
And so the one question that came up quite a few times is, sorry, now I've lost the question. Okay, I'm going to go here. The NBOME within their documentation talks about the student requesting the accommodation for their national board exams should provide the longevity of the disability. If the accommodation is only identified when they're in medical school, how do we encourage the accommodation committee to give an accommodation for a recently identified disability? Because this may be disadvantaging the student when doing national boards.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I'm kind of shocked that I didn't choose that as one of my 4 topics. It is something that everybody's mad about. So it's, it is definitely a hot topic. And there are 2 things that I would tell you. One, I think transparency and disclosure at first point of contact is really important. So that's to say, to the student, hey, we're going to interpret your documentation this way. However, you need to know that the MBOME is going to interpret it differently. They're going to use the average person standard. And because of this, you may not get accommodations. And if you're newly diagnosed, you may not get accommodations. You need to be aware of that. And you can make decisions. These are adults. They can make decisions about what they do as far as studying. I would not recommend anything. I've heard of people saying, don't study with extra time or whatever. I think that's for the student to decide. But I think transparency about the potential for that is super important. What I have witnessed, seeing a lot of packets that have gone off to both the MBOME, by the way, and the MBME. So I've seen both. I see a disconnect. I see disability service providers that are not aware of how to write the letters and letters of support in a way that is, in a way that doesn't discount the disability. So for example, one of the biggest lines I will see is, I had this disability, I struggled, but I worked really hard and I overcame it. And now I just need extra time. And in that sentence, you have essentially dismiss the fact that you have a disability. If you overcome something, then you no longer have it. And the boards will use that terminology, and they're not using it for you. They're using it, you know, against you. So there's an art form, I think, to crafting these letters. I do about once a year, I do trainings on this. I'm doing one in December, but I also have a packet that is free. My goal is to make the world free if I can, but I created a packet while at UCSF. And Jamie, I believe it's on the resource list, but I can't be sure, but it is definitely on the coalition website. And I think it's not on my website, but I think it's definitely on the coalition website under resources for students. So that packet is something that you would give students, and it would help them. It walks them through, you know, how to write a letter, a personal statement, and how to combine all of their information in a way that presents a case, an airtight case. And that's what I did. I actually had a 99% acceptance rate by the MBME when I was at UCSF for my learners. But I spent about 12 to 13 hours on every single packet, working with the student, crafting the story, you know, making the argument airtight. And I know everyone doesn't have time for that. But you do have to some degree, kind of identify and learn where the gaps are and what they're going to go after, and then answer those questions before they can go after them. So you're filling in those holes and telling a story. And then most importantly, most people will say this student gets time and a half because they have dyslexia. And that's actually not an answer. What the MBOME and the MBME need you to do is say, the student has dyslexia. It causes this functional limitation. This functional limitation is expressed this way on standardized exams in a computer format. Because of this, there is a barrier that's created. To remove the barrier, you must do this. So it's like an algebra equation, you know, x plus y equals z. You have to be able to very, very tightly make these arguments and show that there's a cause and effect that's disability related, and that it is specific to this type of exam. So, you know, I use sample letters in my training. I don't make them publicly available because they are actually letters. De-identified as they are, they're still people's personal stories. So I apologize for that. But between the chapter in the book on the topic and the packet that's free on the coalition website, I think you'll get a lot of information that you might not have had prior to this. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, and you actually made many ask more questions, but unfortunately I know that your time is precious, and so we are going to have to end the webinar. I will make sure that you get these questions and see if we can't somehow collate them to respond if possible. Again, I know on behalf of all of our comms, we really appreciate you spending your afternoon with us, and it seems like we have learned a lot, but it have also allowed us or required us to ask a lot more questions, which I think is the goal as well. So thank you, Lisa, and thank you for all of the colleges that took the time to spend with us today. This recording will be available on our website in a few days, along with the chat transcript and all of the resources that Dr. Meeks provided. And one more last plug, that if you could fill out the survey to provide Lisa with that information. Of course, this will all go back to you once she has completed the research. So thank you. Have a wonderful day.